Have you ever felt that God has abandoned you even though you continue praying, attending Mass, and trying to live a holy life? Have you experienced that crushing weight in your soul that seems to have no earthly explanation? That spiritual dryness that makes every prayer feel like words thrown into an empty void? What if I told you that these very experiences, which feel like spiritual death, might actually be the most precious signs that God is purifying your soul for something greater? Saint Teresa of Jesus, Doctor of the Church and mystic extraordinaire, lived through these exact torments. In the depths of her spiritual journey, she discovered something that revolutionized her understanding of God's love. She learned that what feels like divine abandonment is often divine preparation. In her masterpiece, The Interior Castle, she writes with brutal honesty about those periods when it seems His Majesty has forgotten the soul. Yet she also reveals the hidden truth. These moments of darkness are not punishments, but privileges reserved for souls God wishes to elevate. Tonight, as you struggle with that inexplicable heaviness in your heart, as you wonder why your prayers feel so empty, remember this. The Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us in section 2731 that prayer may encounter particular difficulty, dryness. But this dryness is not a sign of failure. It's not evidence that you're doing something wrong. According to the great mystics, it's often the first sign that God is beginning a deeper work in your soul, a purification that will prepare you for intimacy with Him that you cannot yet imagine. The spiritual life is not a straight path upward. It's a mysterious journey through valleys of shadow that lead to peaks of light. Saint Teresa discovered that God sometimes hides His consolations not to punish us, but to teach us to love Him for Himself, not for the good feelings He gives us. When you can barely feel God's presence, when your heart feels like stone, when every spiritual exercise seems meaningless, these may be the very moments when you're being transformed into the person God always intended you to become. Are you ready to see your spiritual struggles through the eyes of the saints? You kneel to pray and feel nothing. The words that once brought comfort now seem to bounce off the ceiling. Your heart, which used to burn with devotion, feels cold as marble. Every spiritual book you pick up seems to mock your emptiness. You wonder, where is the God I once felt so close to? But what if this very dryness is the first symptom that God is purifying your soul at a level deeper than emotions? Saint Teresa of Avila knew this torture intimately. For nearly 20 years of her religious life, she struggled with what spiritual directors call aridez, a state where the soul can find no consolation in prayer, no sweetness in spiritual things, no emotional connection to God. In her autobiography, she describes feeling like a person who cannot speak before God, convinced that her prayers were worthless. Yet it was precisely during these years that God was working most powerfully in her soul, preparing her for the extraordinary mystical graces that would follow. The Catechism explains in section 2731 that this dryness is normal and even necessary for spiritual growth. It teaches us that prayer is a battle, and that we must persevere even when we feel nothing. Saint Teresa discovered that spiritual dryness serves a divine purpose. It purifies our motivations. When prayer feels good, we might be seeking the consolation rather than the consoler. When prayer is difficult, we prove that we love God for Himself, not for what He gives us. This is love in its purest form, the love of someone who serves without reward, who remains faithful without feeling. But how do you distinguish between spiritual dryness as purification and spiritual dryness as a sign that something is wrong? Saint Teresa provides the key. Examine your desires. If, despite the dryness, you still long for God, still want to pray, still feel called to holiness, even if you feel nothing, then this is likely purification. The soul being purified by God doesn't lose its fundamental orientation toward Him. It simply learns to walk by faith rather than by sight. Are you learning to love God in the darkness, or are you demanding that He prove Himself to your emotions before you'll trust Him? The silence is deafening. You cry out to God and hear only your own echo. You search for Him in prayer, in Scripture, in the Eucharist, and find only absence. Your soul feels like a house where the lights have gone out and the doors have been locked from the inside. Everyone around you seems to experience God's presence while you wander in a spiritual desert that seems to stretch endlessly in every direction. This feeling of divine abandonment isn't a sign that you've done something wrong. It might be the second symptom that God is purifying your soul. Saint Teresa describes this experience with heartbreaking honesty in the sixth mansion of her interior castle. She writes about souls who feel that God has abandoned them and who experience great trials, interior and exterior. She knew this agony personally. There were periods when she felt completely cut off from God, when every spiritual practice felt meaningless, when she wondered if her entire religious life had been a delusion. Yet she learned through these dark nights that God's apparent absence was actually a deeper form of His presence, a way of teaching the soul to love without conditions. This apparent abandonment serves a crucial purpose in God's plan for your soul. When God feels close, it's easy to mistake the gift for the giver. When He feels absent, you're forced to choose. Will you love Him anyway? Will you remain faithful even when you receive nothing in return? Saint Teresa discovered that this apparent abandonment is actually God's way of weaning the soul from spiritual selfishness. He withdraws the consolations to see if you love Him or just love how He makes you feel. It's the difference between loving someone for their money and loving them for themselves. The key to surviving this spiritual abandonment is understanding its purpose. God isn't playing cruel games with your heart. He's preparing you for a love so pure, so selfless, that it doesn't depend on feelings or consolations. Saint Teresa teaches that souls who persevere through this apparent abandonment often receive the greatest graces later. They become capable of loving God with a love that can't be shaken by circumstances, emotions, or even the absence of spiritual consolations. If you're feeling abandoned by God right now, take comfort. He may be preparing your heart for an intimacy with Him that requires this temporary separation. If this message is speaking to your heart, do something powerful right now. Subscribe to this channel and write in the comments, "Saint Teresa, teach me to trust even in the darkness." Your testimony could be the light another soul needs to keep going today. The doubts come like thieves in the night, stealing your certainty when you least expect it. Questions you've never asked before suddenly demand answers your heart can't provide. What if none of this is real? What if I've been fooling myself? What if God doesn't exist at all? These thoughts terrify you because they feel so foreign to who you thought you were. But what if these very doubts, painful as they are, constitute the third symptom that God is purifying your soul at the deepest level? Saint Teresa herself experienced periods of profound doubt that shook her to her core. Despite her extraordinary mystical experiences, she went through phases where everything she believed seemed uncertain. In her letters to her spiritual directors, she confesses moments when she wondered if her visions were real or mere imagination, if her sense of God's presence was authentic or self-deception. Yet she learned that these trials of faith weren't signs of weakness or failure. They were opportunities for her faith to become unshakable by moving beyond the realm of feelings into the realm of pure trust. The Catechism teaches in section 164 that faith is often lived in obscurity and that it can be put to the test. This isn't a flaw in the spiritual life, it's an essential part of it. God allows our faith to be tested not because He doubts our love, but because He wants to purify that love from anything false or self-serving. When you can believe without seeing, trust without feeling, hope without evidence, that's when your faith becomes truly supernatural. It's no longer dependent on your emotions, your circumstances, or even your ability to understand God's ways. The difference between the doubt that comes from rebellion and the doubt that comes from purification lies in your response. When doubt comes from pride, it leads to cynicism and abandonment of the spiritual life. When doubt comes from purification, it leads to deeper humility and more desperate clinging to God. Saint Teresa noticed that her periods of doubt always increased her desire for God, even when she couldn't feel His presence. She wanted to believe even when believing felt impossible. If your doubts are making you hunger more for God rather than driving you away from Him, this may be the mysterious way He's strengthening your faith through apparent weakness. There's a pain in your soul that has no name, no clear origin, no earthly remedy. Your life might be going well by all external measures, yet you carry a weight that no one else can see. You feel tears that won't come, grief that won't heal, and a sadness that seems to emerge from the depths of your being for no reason you can identify. Friends and family might tell you to snap out of it or suggest practical solutions, but they don't understand that this isn't depression in the clinical sense. It's something deeper, more mysterious, and perhaps more sacred. Saint Teresa knew this inexplicable suffering intimately. Throughout her spiritual journey, she experienced periods of interior anguish that had no external cause. Her body might be healthy, her relationships stable, her duties fulfilled, yet her soul would be racked with a pain she described as dying without being able to die. In her Way of Perfection, she writes about these mysterious sufferings as some of the most precious gifts God can give to a soul, because they unite us to Christ's passion in a way that no external trial ever could. This interior suffering serves a purpose that transcends human understanding. While the world teaches us to avoid pain at all costs, the mystics discovered that certain kinds of spiritual pain are actually forms of grace. They purify the soul of attachments, pride, and self-will that we might not even realize we possess. When you suffer without being able to pinpoint why, your soul is being prepared for a deeper participation in Christ's redemptive work. Saint Teresa taught that souls who accept this mysterious suffering with patience often receive extraordinary graces and become powerful intercessors for others. The key to bearing this mysterious pain is not to try to explain it away or solve it with human remedies, but to offer it as a gift to God. Saint Teresa discovered that when she united her inexplicable sufferings to Christ's passion, they became sources of grace, not only for herself but for souls she would never meet in this life. Your mysterious pain isn't meaningless. It might be the very means by which God is transforming you into an instrument of His love. When you can't understand your suffering, can you trust that God understands it perfectly and is using it for purposes greater than you can imagine? You want to pray, but you can't. You long to serve God, but you feel paralyzed. Your heart burns with desire for holiness, yet you seem incapable of taking even the smallest steps toward it. This isn't laziness or lack of commitment. It's a profound spiritual helplessness that leaves you feeling like a person dying of thirst who can see water but cannot reach it. This painful combination of intense desire and complete impotence might feel like spiritual failure, but it could be the fifth and perhaps most transformative symptom of a soul being purified by God. Saint Teresa experienced this agonizing paradox repeatedly throughout her spiritual journey. She would feel overwhelming desires to love God perfectly, to surrender completely, to pray without ceasing, yet find herself utterly unable to act on these desires. In moments when she most wanted to draw close to God, she felt most incapable of doing so. She describes feeling like a person who has lost the power of speech when she most needed to cry out to God. Yet she came to understand that this very helplessness was itself a gift, stripping away her illusions of self-sufficiency. This experience of spiritual impotence serves a crucial purpose in God's plan for the soul. As long as we believe we can earn God's love, achieve holiness, or perfect ourselves through our own efforts, we remain trapped in spiritual pride. When God allows us to feel our complete inability to save ourselves, we finally become ready to receive the grace that has been available all along. Jesus Himself teaches in John 15:5, "Without me, you can do nothing." This isn't meant to discourage us. It's meant to free us from the exhausting burden of trying to be our own saviors. The Catechism explains in section 2737 that prayer cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior impulse. Sometimes prayer requires us to persevere even when we feel nothing, can do nothing, and understand nothing. Saint Teresa discovered that when she offered her impotence to God instead of fighting against it, miraculous things began to happen. Her weakness became the very space where God's strength could operate. When you feel most incapable of reaching God, you might actually be in the perfect position to let God reach you. Can you trust that your spiritual weakness is not an obstacle to grace, but an invitation for it? You are not alone in this mysterious journey of purification. For over 2,000 years, countless saints have walked this same path of spiritual darkness and emerged transformed. Saint John of the Cross, Saint Teresa's contemporary and spiritual director, wrote extensively about what he called the dark night of the soul, those periods when God seems absent precisely because He is working most intimately in the depths of the spirit. These experiences aren't modern inventions or psychological phenomena, they're ancient patterns of how God forms saints. Saint Teresa found great comfort in discovering that the greatest mystics before her had experienced similar purifications. She studied the lives of the Desert Fathers, who spent years in spiritual aridity before receiving extraordinary graces. She read about St. Augustine's struggles with doubt and spiritual dryness. She learned that even the apostles experienced periods when they couldn't understand Jesus' teachings and felt confused about their calling. This historical perspective helped her understand that what felt like personal failure was actually participation in a universal pattern of spiritual growth. The unanimous testimony of the mystics is that God purifies souls He intends to use in extraordinary ways. Saint Teresa of Jesus experienced profound spiritual darkness in her final years, feeling that heaven might not exist even as she was dying for love of God. Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta lived for decades with an interior darkness that made her feel abandoned by the very God she served so heroically. These weren't signs of spiritual failure. They were signs of spiritual privilege, invitations to love God with a purity that transcends all feeling and understanding. Modern psychology has begun to recognize what the saints always knew, that periods of spiritual crisis often precede breakthrough to new levels of maturity and wisdom. Researchers studying post-traumatic growth have found that people who navigate difficult experiences often emerge with greater resilience, deeper compassion, and stronger sense of purpose. The saints understood this principle centuries before science could measure it. They knew that souls refined in the fire of spiritual purification become capable of love, service, and trust that would be impossible without that refining process. Not every spiritual difficulty is a sign of purification. Sometimes what feels like divine testing is actually the result of sin, poor spiritual direction, or even psychological issues that need proper attention. Saint Teresa, with her characteristic wisdom and practical sense, provides clear criteria for distinguishing between authentic purification and other forms of spiritual distress. Learning to make this distinction could save you years of unnecessary confusion and help you respond appropriately to what God is actually doing in your soul. The first key difference lies in your fundamental orientation toward God. In authentic purification, despite all the darkness and difficulty, your deepest desire remains fixed on God. You may feel nothing, understand little, and struggle greatly, but underneath it all, you still want Him more than anything else. Saint Teresa noticed that even in her darkest periods, she never lost her fundamental attraction to holiness, even when holiness seemed impossible to achieve. True purification purifies the will's desires, not the will's direction. The second distinguishing mark is humility versus despair. Spiritual purification tends to increase humility. You become more aware of your need for God, more compassionate toward others' struggles, more grateful for small graces. Desolation that comes from other sources often produces despair, cynicism, or spiritual pride disguised as sophistication. Saint Teresa observed that souls undergoing authentic purification become gentler with themselves and others, while those experiencing other forms of distress often become harsh, critical, or self-righteous. The third criterion is the presence of peace beneath the struggle. This seems paradoxical, but mystics consistently report that even in their darkest nights, there remains a deep peace that surpasses understanding. This isn't emotional peace, it's something deeper, a fundamental trust that God knows what He's doing even when you don't. Saint Teresa called it peace in the center of the soul that remains untouched even when the surface is turbulent. If your spiritual difficulties are accompanied by increasing anxiety, bitterness, or desperation rather than this deep peace, you may need to examine other possible causes and seek appropriate help. God doesn't purify souls for His own benefit. He needs nothing from us. He purifies them because He loves them too much to leave them as they are. Every moment of spiritual darkness, every feeling of abandonment, every mysterious suffering serves a purpose in God's plan to transform you into the person He created you to be. Understanding this purpose doesn't make the suffering easier, but it can make it meaningful. And meaning has the power to transform even the most difficult experiences into sources of growth and grace. The primary purpose of spiritual purification is to free the soul from subtle forms of self-love that masquerade as love of God. Saint Teresa discovered that many of her early spiritual experiences, which seemed so pure and holy, were actually mixed with spiritual pride, desire for consolation, and unconscious self-seeking. God allowed her to experience dryness, doubt, and difficulty not to punish these imperfections, but to gradually burn them away. Like gold tested in fire, the the soul emerges from purification with its love for God refined of all dross. Another crucial purpose is to prepare the soul for deeper intimacy with God. Just as human relationships deepen when love persists through difficulty, our relationship with God reaches new depths when we continue to trust Him despite experiencing His apparent absence. Saint Teresa noticed that souls who had weathered periods of purification developed a quality of love that was unshakable. They could trust God in any circumstance because they had learned to trust Him in the most difficult circumstances of all. Finally, purified souls become powerful instruments of grace for others. Saint Teresa observed that people who had been refined by spiritual suffering possessed a unique ability to comfort others in their trials. They could speak with authority about God's faithfulness because they had experienced it in situations where faithfulness seemed impossible. Their very presence became a source of hope for others struggling in darkness. Your current suffering isn't just about your own spiritual development. It's preparation for the role God wants you to play in His plan of salvation for the world. The darkness will not last forever. Saint Teresa promises that souls who persevere through authentic purification emerge into a light more brilliant than they ever experienced before their trials began. This isn't simply a return to their former state. It's an advancement to a completely new level of intimacy with God. The very experiences that seem to separate them from God become the foundation for a union with Him that can never be shaken, because it has been tested and proven genuine in the most challenging circumstances. In the final mansions of her interior castle, Saint Teresa describes souls who have passed through the crucible of purification and arrived at what she calls spiritual marriage, a state of such profound union with God that they experience His presence constantly, even in the midst of external trials and difficulties. These souls have learned to find God not in consolations or extraordinary experiences, but in the depths of their being where He has always resided. The purification process didn't drive them away from God. It taught them where He had been hiding all along. The transformation that follows authentic purification affects every aspect of life. These souls develop an unshakable peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, a love that can embrace even their enemies, and a trust that remains firm even when they can't see the way forward. They become living witnesses to the reality of God's love, not because their lives are easy, but because their love for God has been proven authentic in the furnace of trial. Others are drawn to them not for their extraordinary experiences, but for their extraordinary ordinariness, their ability to live with profound peace in the midst of a chaotic world. Most importantly, souls who have been purified by God discover that the very experiences that once felt like punishments were actually the greatest gifts they ever received. Saint Teresa wrote that she wouldn't trade her years of dryness and difficulty for any consolation, because those years taught her to love God for Himself rather than for what He could give her. If you're currently walking through the darkness of purification, take heart. You're being prepared for a light that will make all your current suffering seem like a small price to pay for the treasure you're about to receive. God's love for you is so great that He refuses to leave you unchanged, and that love, working through apparent darkness, is transforming you into the masterpiece He